The case was closed 7 days after the deceased's remains were discovered. It should not have been. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, but the medical examiner disagreed. Upon closer examination, a fractured skull was identified as a significant factor. This traumatic injury was characterized by multiple linear and depressed fractures, indicative of blunt force trauma to the head. Initial reports failed to account for these critical findings, leading to an incomplete assessment of the deceased's cause of death. The subsequent autopsy revealed extensive hemorrhaging in the brain tissue, consistent with severe impact from external forces. It became evident that this traumatic injury was indeed a contributing factor to the fatal outcome. This case underscores the importance of thorough forensic investigation and highlights the potential for misdiagnosis when less invasive methods are relied upon exclusively. Chapter: Case background. The case under review involves a report of an unresponsive individual located within a private residence in downtown Springfield on October 15th, at approximately 8:45 p.m. local time. The initial notification was received from the deceased's spouse, who had returned home from work to find the front door ajar and no sign of activity upon entry. Upon further investigation inside the living room, the spouse observed the deceased lying motionless on the floor near an overturned coffee table. Emergency services were immediately contacted, and upon arrival, first responders noted multiple injuries, including significant bruising around the head area and evidence of trauma to other parts of the body. The scene was cordoned off for further investigation by local law enforcement, who collected preliminary evidence before transferring responsibility to the medical examiner's office for a thorough forensic examination. The deceased's state and surroundings suggested potential blunt force trauma as the cause, necessitating an immediate autopsy to determine the extent of injuries and ascertain the definitive manner of death. Chapter: Initial findings. Upon arrival at the scene, first responders noted a male body in a supine position within a residential living room. The deceased was partially covered by a blanket, and there were no visible signs of external hemorrhaging or puncture wounds to suggest sharp force trauma. However, there was a pronounced swelling on the occipital region of the skull, indicative of potential blunt force impact. No immediate signs of defensive wounds suggested that the deceased may have been caught off guard during an altercation. Initial medical assessment by emergency services revealed a dilated and unresponsive pupil consistent with possible cerebral edema or intracranial hemorrhage. There was no evidence of intoxication or drug use based on initial observations, leading to the classification of manner of death as undetermined pending further forensic examination. The scene investigation was triggered upon identification of this potential blunt force trauma to the head, necessitating a thorough autopsy and forensic analysis for definitive cause of death determination. Chapter: Forensic investigation. At the scene, a variety of physical evidence was collected for forensic analysis. Notably, multiple wooden splinters consistent with impact from a blunt object were found embedded in the scalp and temporal region of the deceased. Swabs and samples of bloodstains on surrounding surfaces provided crucial DNA evidence. A fragmented piece of a broken bottle near the body suggested a possible weapon. However, no firearms or sharp instruments were identified that could have caused the cranial trauma. The chain of custody was meticulously maintained throughout collection and transport to ensure integrity. Notably absent were signs of forced entry, indicating the potential for an altercation within the home. Unexpectedly, personal items such as keys and a wallet were found untouched nearby, suggesting premeditation or familiarity between victim and assailant. The laboratory analysis included a comprehensive evaluation of the cranial tissues to determine the nature and extent of the traumatic injury. A CT scan was conducted, revealing multiple fractures within the occipital region consistent with blunt force trauma. Radiographic imaging confirmed the presence of comminuted skull fractures and associated subdural hematoma extending over 50 cubic centimeters in volume. Histological examination of tissue samples from the fracture sites demonstrated evidence of hemorrhagic necrosis and acute inflammatory response, indicative of recent injury. Microscopic analysis revealed disruptions in the cortical bone structure with significant loss of trabecular integrity. Hemoglobin levels in cerebrospinal fluid were elevated above normal thresholds, confirming intracranial bleeding. These findings collectively support a diagnosis of severe traumatic brain injury resulting from blunt force trauma to the head. The examination of the deceased revealed multiple fractures consistent with blunt force trauma to the head, indicating a severe impact event. Radiographic imaging and forensic anthropology techniques were employed to assess bone density and fracture patterns, which provided insight into the timing and nature of the injuries sustained prior to death. The postmortem interval was estimated through analysis of body temperature and rigor mortis onset, suggesting an approximate time of death within 24 hours before discovery. Pollen samples collected from the vicinity corroborated this timeline by matching with known local flora cycles. Microscopic examination of blood spatter patterns on surrounding objects further supported a scenario where multiple impacts occurred shortly before or during the final moments of life. This sequence was confirmed by forensic entomology observations, which indicated no significant insect activity beyond what would be expected within the calculated timeframe. The timeline established through these methods confirmed the rapid progression from injury to death without contradicting any other evidence presented at the scene. The examination of the deceased revealed multiple comminuted fractures to the cranial vault, consistent with blunt force trauma inflicted by a heavy, cylindrical object. Forensic pathologists noted depressed skull fractures indicative of localized impact from an instrument such as a crowbar or similar implement. Radiological imaging confirmed these findings and identified intracranial hemorrhaging, contributing to the cause of death. The pattern of injuries suggested a single assailant with intent to inflict lethal harm. Expert testimony would affirm that these traumatic injuries were indeed caused by external blunt force rather than self-inflicted means. While the specific implement remains speculative without direct comparison, the forensic evidence conclusively points towards a heavy, cylindrical object as the weapon used in this fatal assault. Interpretive aspects include the sequence of events leading to the final impact, but do not detract from the conclusive nature of the traumatic injury findings. Chapter Resolution: The examination of the deceased revealed a significant traumatic injury, resulting in a fractured skull consistent with blunt force trauma. Initial findings indicated multiple fractures across various regions of the cranium, including the parietal and temporal bones. Radiographic imaging confirmed these observations, showing disruptions to both cortical and trabecular bone structures indicative of severe impact. Upon further analysis, it was determined that the injuries were incompatible with life, suggesting a swift cessation of consciousness following the initial trauma. The absence of defensive wounds or evidence of prolonged struggle suggested a single, forceful event as the cause of death. This was corroborated by forensic pathology reports and expert testimony from biomechanical specialists. Revisiting the scene of the incident provided additional context, with forensic technicians identifying potential impact objects consistent with the pattern and severity of injuries observed on the deceased's skull. These findings shifted the initial assessment from multiple possible causes to a singular traumatic event as the definitive cause of death. Thus, the central finding was conclusively established, providing clarity for both legal proceedings and closure for involved parties. Analysis of the fractured skull reveals critical insights into the application of forensic pathology and the meticulous documentation required for accurate determination of blunt force trauma mechanisms. This case underscores the importance of comprehensive radiological imaging and detailed anatomical examination in confirming traumatic injury patterns. The file remains open,